Former Vice President Kamala Harris just sat down with our colleague Eugene Daniels for an exclusive interview that will air tomorrow morning on The Weekend. And she had this warning about the Trump Justice Department.
What the DOJ does, and you know this better than I do, is so fundamental to the backbone of the country, right?
Yeah.
The rule of law versus the rule of men. Can Americans trust the criminal justice system right now and what's coming out of the DOJ?
I don't know if we can trust what's coming out of the Department of Justice right now. And that pains me to say that as someone who spent the majority of my career as a prosecutor, where the work of a prosecutor should be to do justice. Many who have worked as U.S. attorneys, worked for the U.S. Department of Justice, talk openly and rightly about the fact that they should do their work without any fear and not in the interest of favor. And that so clearly is not what is ruling the day there. And when you have an administration and individuals who are manipulating the justice system of America in that way, they best understand that this is not only about something that affects the individuals that they're targeting. This affects all of us who believe that, flawed though it may be, that a justice system is actually supposed to be blind in the way that it does its work, not targeting people because of who they are, or for that matter, what they look like.
Jake and Maria are still with us. Jake, so how significant is it to hear that, not only from a former vice president, but a former state attorney general herself who came out and is now saying, can't trust the Department of Justice under Trump?
Yeah, I mean, not something I imagine she would have said during the campaign or any time previous to this, but also I think it gives it a little extra weight in that we know how careful Kamala Harris tends to want to be with her answers and how precisely she's going to structure whatever, new line she's going to push on that. And in line by in the sense that she's going further than she normally would in saying, like, yes, it is legitimate to have confidence issues in the DOJ around this type of corruption, not just historical dynamics or anything like that, but specifically the transactional nature of this administration.
What do you
Maria,
think?
yeah, do you see that? I mean, especially just given what we hear may happen to John Bolton in the next few days, what we are seeing Letitia James go through.
Yeah.
Does she have a point?
Yeah, I mean, it's not okay, right? And I think when you look, I think she's right? Justice should be blind, right? I worked for a former U.S. attorney who, when he was U.S. attorney, he put both Republicans and Democrats in jail because they were doing things that they shouldn't be doing, right? And your political orientation shouldn't matter, right? And I think this also goes back to, I think, just larger trust issues in general we've had with our institutions, and specifically with DOJ and both sides at different times, I think, using litigation in lieu of a political strategy. And I think that's just bad, right? And I think for us to really move forward to move out of this phase, it's like we have to back away from that. So every time you see Trump do something that's clearly politically oriented, as we're seeing now here, whether it's Tish James or someone else, it's just it takes us a step back, right? Frankly, as a country, and I'm also a big believer here, like, you can't do the whataboutism, right? It's just never okay, and we can't ever be excusing it or only being okay with certain actions when we're politically aligned with an individual or we feel wronged politically.
So what do you make of the timing of Tish James? What are you hearing from your White House sources, given that there's 10 more years that could be put before a court? Obviously, Comey's charges were because the statute of limitations
right up against the buzzer.
But it does seem like Trump has upped the tempo of going after perceived enemies.
Yeah, well, part of what I'm calling around and I'm curious about is Lindsay Halligan basically not running this by Todd Blanche and Pam Bondi. And the fact that that's even like something that someone would consider leaking and having out there, I think is a very notable development in terms of Bondi's standing. But look, I mean, that's the question I've been asking myself on this beat is, like, they had the list pretty clearly in mind. There's this guy, Ivan Raiklin, who literally brands himself as Trump's Secretary of Retribution. Why weren't these charges coming out in the first weeks or months of them retaking office?
Well, to your point, Judge Shara Shenlin, we had on the show earlier, she interpreted that development about Bondi to be Bondi likely wanting distance from what Lindsay Halligan is doing. Is that at all what you are hearing, what you've sensed, or the question that you've had? Or how do you read these tea leaves?
So at least among like Trump's core advisors, inner circle, Bondi's standing is really, really
Well,
bad.
yeah, you have a great new piece out where you have basically polled Trump insiders about the rankings of cabinet secretaries. So
Yeah. So I give a bunch of Trump advisors just sort of a form 1 through 5 rank who you think is in the worst standing with the president. And everyone had either Pam Bondi or Howard Lutnick in the number 1 slot. And they were often 1 or 2. So, or 1 and 2, I should say. And there was one advisor who gets a little creative and he put Bondi 1 through 4 and then lumped in a bunch of other people at number 5. Now, I tried to ask follow-up questions here about Jeff Epstein and no one wanted to bring that up. But clearly Lutnick and Bondi having these sort of, unforced errors around Epstein and the fact that that seems to draw more ire from Trump's advisors than the stuff we've seen from Hegseth, RFK Jr., Tulsi Gabbard, Kristi Noem. I can keep going, but.
Yeah. Well, no, I was going to say, this is like always the thing with Trump, right? Trump was very clear in 24 during that campaign that this was his second term was going to be about retribution, crystal clear. And I think this is always the way, right? People then go work for him and somehow think like, oh, it's not going to be quite that or quite as bad, and then find themselves in situations where they have to navigate the exact thing he said he was going to do. And so I do think you're seeing a little bit of that here where certain folks are, now that they're actually in the position they have to execute on this, are a little bit wary, which I guess we should be somewhat grateful for.
So to pick up on Jake's reporting here, if you were to look at the trend between Lutnick and Pam Bondi, how much of that is driven, do you think, by Epstein? How much do you think it's the fact that maybe she's not moving as fast as Trump would like her in the retribution campaign? We saw that and NBC News had this reporting that the message that Donald Trump posted on social media where he's like, hey, you need to kind of pick it up, was supposed to be a direct message, but somehow inadvertently ended up being, our Wall Street Journal ended up being, put out publicly.
Yeah. Well, I think it's, look, I look at Epstein and it's a little bit like, the dog caught the car in the sense that, they were leveraging something that they felt was politically helpful to them, right? And then, she got a little too over her skis on it, right? And then she was put in a bad spot as a result of it. And so maybe she's a little bit learning her lesson from that and not as willing to put herself in the same position as she was in that sense. But I think fundamentally, right, anyone who's working in the administration, working for Trump, you start out with a certain amount of political capital at the beginning, and it just inevitably, whittles down to 0 by the end of it. And I think that's what you're seeing here.
Or conversely, you try to save it for this worst case scenario, like a January 6th or something, and you end up letting a whole bunch of other stuff slide because I got to keep my punches for when they matter on whatever that other issue is.
Yeah.
Maria Kamela, Jake LaHutte, it's great to see you both. Thank you.